Good morning or good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. This is Danny Dhaiphong, your host for another live stream. And as you can see, I'm joined by Brian Berletic of the New Atlas. How are you doing, Brian?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me back.
Of course. So you all know what to do as you're coming into the stream. Make sure that you're hitting that like button, subscribing if you are new here. And of course, you can support this channel. All the links are in the video description for how to do that. And in the title, Brian's channel is tagged, so you can go over there and subscribe if you are new to Brian. So let's get to this, Brian. I wanted to first talk about the recent attack on Crimea. The Ukrainian Air Force, or what's left of it, did conduct a missile attack. It was reported by Sky News and others that this attack used Storm Shadow missiles supplied by the United Kingdom. Could you talk about the significance of this attack? Because the Western mainstream media is reporting this as almost like a breakthrough, something that shows that Ukraine is certainly not finished in this conflict. What is your take on it? How do you see this attack in terms of its significance on the battlefield and perhaps even more broadly than that?
Oh, it's very similar to during Desert Storm when Iraq managed to get some lucky Scud missile attacks in. It wasn't going to change the outcome, not even remotely. It had no impact on, say, America or its coalition partners' combat power, and the same applies to this attack. In order for these type of attacks to have an impact on Russian combat power, it would have to be happening several times a week. This is once or twice a month, these type of attacks. The last attack like this was, I think, about 2 weeks ago, that airfield where they destroyed two, maybe damaged several other of these transport planes, which Russia continuously manufactures. And this attack on Crimea, Sevastopol, the naval facility, this was a dry dock facility. There were two naval vessels, supposedly a submarine, a diesel electric Kilo class submarine, and a landing ship. Neither one of these were participating in the military operations. They were in dry dock. Usually you put a ship in dry dock for months at a time. They were being refitted, and depending on how much damage, they'll either be repaired or they have to clear them out and build new ships, which Russia is capable of doing. Conversely, Ukraine has no meaningful navy. They have these naval drones. Russia has naval drones. They have no ships. Their air force is depleted. I think they took out possibly an S-300 or S-400 launcher, or maybe a radar system. Because when they say S-400 or S-300 system. They don't explain that it's actually numerous vehicles, and they probably only hit one of several vehicles in the system. And they celebrate this as a major victory when in reality, Russia has completely devastated Ukraine's air defense systems. Their Soviet era S-300s have been wiped out more or less. That's why the West is sending their air defense systems to Ukraine, and in inadequate numbers. So what it really is a distraction away from the failed offensive, failed or failing, depending on whether you want to put yourself out there and say that has officially failed. It is not making the progress that they claimed that it would. It is 3 full months of fighting going on to 4 months of fighting, and they have not even broken through the first of Russia's major defense lines. They're working their way through the security zone. And so they need something to distract away from this failure, and that is what these attacks are meant to do. The U.S. threatening Russia to send things like ATACMS, or Germany sending additional air-launched cruise missiles, Taurus. This is all, again, depending on your point of view, it could seem as if the West is desperate to try to send a war-winning capability to Ukraine, which none of these are. Or it could be a way of trying to pressure Russia to capitulate in one way or another. Not completely, I don't think the West imagines that, but maybe go to the negotiation table, maybe freeze the conflict. That would suit NATO, the United States, and the rest of NATO quite well, because then they could rearm Ukraine, just as they did from 2014 onward, using the Minsk agreements as a smokescreen. So I think that's really where we are and what these attacks represent.
Yeah, well, the attack, there's been narratives bandied about by various players in this. Ukraine has, of course, committed to waging this conflict for Crimea, never giving up the fact that Crimea long ago voted itself into the Russian Federation. But the United States and the collective West has taken a very, how should I say, bipolar almost position on this. On the one hand, they often say, well, we're not 100% into the retaking of Crimea. But on the other hand, they supply weapons and oftentimes just go along with what the Ukrainian military, with what Zelensky or whoever is saying about taking back Crimea. So, one, do you feel like these attacks on Crimea can increase? Like, does Ukraine have the ability to actually do more of this and perhaps pressure Russia to the negotiating table? Because I've heard many people say that, or at least smarter people, for example, like Alexander Makuris say, smarter people on this conflict in the mainstream media, they say, like, maybe this is a way to look good at the negotiating table. Like, look at what we can do once you get there, come from a position of strength. Do you see that as a possibility here, that Ukraine could even step these kind of attacks up as the conflict moves into this frozen territory on the battlefield, on that front line?
I agree with that. And yes, Alexander Makuris and Alex Christoforou discussed this often on their program, that these weapons that are being sent, the threat of sending ATACMS, the German Taurus, which is similar to the Storm Shadow and Scalp, they're not meant to win the war. Obviously, they cannot win the war, but they're there to put pressure on Russia, again, ahead of negotiations, or to try to draw them into negotiations and for some reason agree to freezing the conflict. And we saw provocations like this. And to answer your question, yes, Ukraine has the capability of doing this. This is basically the only thing they can do, are these highly visible stunts that don't change the overall fighting, will not change the overall outcome of the fighting, but create these headlines and make Russia look bad, and make people backing Russia angry and impatient, and giving false hope to people who are rooting on Ukraine. That's really the only thing that they can do. So I think they will continue focusing on this. The offensive has been a complete failure. So they're going to continue to do this. They have these capabilities, these long-range cruise missiles. They may get these ATACMS, these ballistic missiles, instead of using them in conjunction with their offensive to actually try to enhance their offensive capabilities. They're using them for these kind of PR stunts.
And how about Russia? On Russia's side, how does Russia view these attacks, and does Russia have the ability, given that the narrative now in the Western mainstream media with the counteroffensive is that, well, Russia learned from its mistakes? I believe that's a pretty wrong-headed narrative. But if we take that narrative and put it onto the situation with Crimea and that these attacks have increased, does Russia have the capability of beating these back as well, to the point where they become almost as irrelevant as Ukraine's constant grind on that front line and the counteroffensive? Like, how do you see Russia's response thus far and its possibilities in the future?
Well, I think for Crimea and for the Sevastopol naval facility, and this is a vulnerable target. They have air defense. They're going to shoot down the majority of these missiles. But when you launch, say, 10 missiles all at one time, there's the possibility that a few will get through. They always will. No air defense is 100% effective. There really is nothing that Russia can do as far as that. But what they can do is realize that they have immense combat power that is generated from across the entirety of the Russian Federation, not just the Crimean Peninsula. They can weather these attacks. They can weather these attempts to humiliate them and pressure them. And again, we saw the exact same thing all throughout the Syrian conflict from 2015 onward, when the Syrian government invited Russia to intervene. We saw multiple attempts to humiliate Russia, to provoke Russia, and Russia never took the bait. They were patient, they were resolute, they saw it through to the end, to the point where now it's the United States clinging to its existence in the Middle East, not just in Syria, but across the wider region. The dynamics there in the region have changed because of Russia's patience and its perseverance, its inability to be provoked. And I think they're going to use the same formula regarding this conflict in Ukraine, although it's going to make a lot of people upset. A lot of ordinary people see this and they say, why isn't President Putin doing more? It's much more complicated than just focusing solely on the battlefield, solely on stopping these attacks. There are so many other factors to consider, and it's not just Moscow playing politics. You have to take in consideration all of these factors in order to actually win. And if you do anything short of winning, ultimately you will lose more lives. So it's because some people will say, well, you're squandering human lives by allowing this to drag on. But if you try to speed it up, if you cave in and allow yourself to be provoked, you can create a situation that's actually much worse for the people you're trying to protect.
We'll talk more about that, because what do you feel like are some of these factors? When it comes to this conflict, it is a conflict not between Russia and Ukraine in some kind of vacuum. It is one that is fully backed and initiated really by NATO. So what are these factors? Because obviously the rationality or lack thereof of the United States-led NATO alliance has something to do with the way that this conflict is fought, I take it. But what's your take?
There's a lot of factors beyond the actual battlefield in Ukraine, or trying to protect the infrastructure, the military or civilian infrastructure in Crimea. There's the rest of the civilian population all across the Russian Federation. Then there are the allies of Russia, countries like India or China. And I've said this many times before. If Russia went in full throttle in February 2022, it would have been much more difficult to convince India, China, and many other nations to lean in Russia's direction. And it would have been very hard to convince other nations to lean over in their direction afterward, which we've seen many nations since do. they're doing that specifically because of the patience and the measured pace that Russia is using to execute this special military operation. It's a special military operation. It's not a total war. And this is what makes it possible for Russia to circumvent the sanctions. That is another factor, the economic situation that Russia is in, circumventing Western sanctions, building up economic ties with other nations around the globe, investing in multipolarism as this conflict continues, and actually using the conflict, again, as Alexander Mercouris pointed out, as a catalyst to accelerate the rise of multipolarism. So all of these are factors that Russia has to take into consideration. And another very important one, the West itself. If Russia allows itself to be provoked and it does something rash, people say, "What, Russia should get revenge against the UK for supplying these cruise missiles to Ukraine." Well, imagine if Russia did exact revenge against the UK in a very direct way. It would give the British government, the European Union, the respective governments within the European Union and the US the ability to further mobilize their populations. Right now, Danny, I mean, you're in the United States. Can you imagine under any condition the U.S. being able to fully mobilize the American people for Ukraine? At this point, I would probably venture a guess and say no. But there are things that Russia could do to provoke, to give the governments across the collective West ammunition to mobilize their population. Russia doesn't want that. They have the advantage in military industrial outputs, militarily, strategically, economically, diplomatically. They have all of the cards in their hand. Why would they jeopardize that by allowing themselves to be provoked?
Yeah, I mean, there was this recent, I don't know if you caught it. I think it was the United War College, or was it the Army College in the United States, that has published a report about the lessons of the Russia-Ukraine war, as they call it, and it literally states that there's a lot of issues with the U.S. military. You've talked about this, and if there's lessons to be learned from this conflict, it's that perhaps the United States needs to start thinking about not only renewed ways and revamped ways of recruiting, but also potentially partial conscription. So that's kind of that's a trend, in terms of this idea. I think this is a trend in the West of, do we have the people power to be able to wage full-scale conflicts like the one that Ukraine is trying to wage with its NATO suppliers on the battlefield? It's increasingly unlikely.
Absolutely. There's so many fundamentals that have been neglected across the collective West in terms of waging large-scale, intense, and protracted warfare. Because, again, over the decades, the West has transformed their militaries to fight these small wars around the developing world, knocking over nations that don't even have standing armies, or who have armies poorly equipped, poorly trained. So that's what they've been doing for decades. And it is not that easy, as people might imagine, to simply transform your military back into a force capable of large-scale combat against a peer or near-peer competitor. This is what the West is now realizing. Oh, wait, we don't have the ability to churn out artillery ammunition to supply Ukraine to even match, let alone exceed, what Russia is firing at them. That is a huge problem. It's, by the way, an unsolvable problem. Not in the immediate or even intermediate future will the collective West be able to manufacture enough artillery shells to supply Ukraine to do that. I was just reading a New York Times article finally admitting to all of these shortcomings, not just in artillery shell production, but missile production, tank production. It turns out that despite Western sanctions, Russia's military industrial output is enormous. It is much larger than the collective West's, and it is getting larger still. How do you win a proxy war like this against Russia if that's the case? And the answer is you don't. So we're watching them do the exact same thing they did in Syria, which was trying to distract and provoke Russia because nothing else was going to work. the United States had no way of winning its proxy war in Syria once Russia intervened. They have absolutely no way of winning this proxy war in Ukraine against Russia at all. And so the only way is to try to trip up Russia, and Russia simply isn't going to take the bait.
Yeah, and I also think that the longer that this conflict goes on in this way, what we've seen similar to Syria is that the narrative control and narrative management, the ability in the public relations sphere to make this conflict out to be what the collective West says it is, has eroded dramatically. It happened in Syria. It was a freedom fighter-led war, almost like the Mujahideen, the famous picture of the Mujahideen sitting down with Ronald Reagan. These are our freedom fighters, similar to Washington and Franklin and whatnot. That's what Reagan said. And Syria 2011, there was supposed to be protests, and the Syrian government brutally cracked down. That's why they had to be sent weapons. That's why there was an armed conflict there. And then over the course of the years, you find out, well, actually, these were, armed jihadist militants supplied by Nato, supplied by Israel, etc., to Saudi Arabia, etc., to wage proxy war inside of Syria. Now, you made a good point, Brian. I just want, before, maybe to close on this particular subject, over the course of this conflict, I think that Ukraine itself, in the collective West, as well, have continued to expose how this conflict is not about some kind of war for democracy or anything like that. And I want your reaction to this. You mentioned India and China. The longer that this conflict has gone on, we can see that Russia has been able to strengthen its relations with India and China, so much so that it triggers Ukraine. And here's Mr. Podolyak, one of Zelensky's top advisors, who shot himself in his own foot, and said that China and India have low intellectual potential. This angered both sides, India and China, with Mao Ning saying, "Hey, explain yourself, please," because that's a very charged comment, to say the least. And of course, he denied it. But as he continued talking, he said, they do not analyze the consequence of their own moves. These countries, unfortunately, have low intellectual potential. That was the original comment. And then he tried to walk it back, but said the global world is much broader, and even the most thoughtful regional and national interests. The global world is based on stability, predictability, rationality, and strategy, on international law and clear rules of the game, insinuating that these countries do not follow that, especially by maintaining relations with Russia. But this is kind of like just saying that that India and China have low intellectual potential simply because they refuse to give up their neutrality on the conflict, I think has exposed this more and more as a proxy war. And so what's your reaction to not only those comments, but also how Russia has been able to play this out in the public relations sphere to make significant gains? And I think significant gains have been made in that area.
Well, I think comments like this reveal the reality of what the post-2014 Ukrainian government has been. It is a regime infested with Nazi ideology, racism, race theory, where the white race is superior, even though they're all Slavs. They pretend somehow that they aren't. They live in a fantasy world. It is 2023, and he even thought of saying something like this. What is wrong with him, and how is he in a position of power, even a pretend position, like the Kiev regime is? It's a client regime. It is a puppet regime. Couldn't they find someone more presentable? And the answer is no. And this is the problem the United States has consistently all around the globe. The only people willing to sign up to work with the United States are people like this in every single country, whether it's Nazi-inspired racists in Ukraine or violent thugs and mass murderers here in Southeast Asia. The worst of the worst seem to be attracted to working with the U.S. while the rest of these countries that are being targeted, they have the actual, the actual people who keep the country running. And when you empower these people over the ordinary people that are actually maintaining a nation state, that is when your nation state falls apart, as Ukraine is. As we see every country the U.S. interferes in and installs a client regime in, we see this collapse because these people are incapable of running a country. The U.S. is not interested in running the country for them. They're interested in taking it and using it and then disposing of it. We've seen this over and over again. Ukraine is just the most recent example. And yes, it does. When he makes comments like this, it just makes it so much easier for Russia to make its case that this really is the West waging a proxy war, not just against Russia, but eventually it's going to expand into China. We've always talked about this, Danny, for a very long time. There already is a proxy war against China ongoing, but it'll continue to expand. And what is going on in Ukraine against Russia is just one part of a much wider strategy the West has been pursuing for decades to encircle and contain both Russia and China and everything along their collective peripheries. So you're absolutely right, and it just makes it for Moscow. It makes it so much easier for them to promote multipolarism, because look at the alternative.
Yeah, and talk about going after countries that ostensibly you'd like to have on your side. I definitely want your comment on the future Zelensky meeting at the United speech at the UN General Assembly. But first, let's get to the counteroffensive now, because I was scouring the media, as I know you often do in your presentations, about the counteroffensive, and I found it interesting. It's both a contrast with a lot of continuity. And so at this moment, I'm just going to pull up a few articles. So here you have, let's say, the Financial Times, and the headline, which of course we live in an era where headline scrolling is pretty dominant, especially in the collective West, where the headline is very gloomy. The hard lessons from Ukraine's summer offensive. The country's military is enjoying some success, but it will be slow going and requires allies to increase ammunition supplies. We don't even really have to go further than that, because that's literally just the argument expanded, saying that there have been slow but significant gains in the country in recent weeks. However, there are meager results, exposing divisions, Ukraine and the United States getting into spats, for example. And then
can you go up to the map, Danny?
Yes, here's the map.
Look at those arrows, and I mean,
right.
That's the map you show before it starts. Like, that's the direction you're going to go in, but they haven't gone anywhere, so that's still the map that they're showing for the offensive.
Yes, and this is that exact map, and this is where the United States is taking a lot of umbrage, is the fact that Ukraine has thrusted most of its forces at very particular points, and they want Ukraine to focus on the south, but there's too much investment in Bakhmut. In any event, as we continue, here Ukraine is getting mad because they think the U.S. doesn't understand their own territory. The U.S. is concerned about the rainy season coming up, or the cold season coming up, as being very wet in the fall. Ukraine says, no. But here it says, after early unsustainable losses, Ukraine pivoted back to a campaign of attrition. And I see this a lot, Brian. I definitely want your comment on it, where now they're framing the war of attrition as being in Ukraine's favor, which I seem to remember Russia actually employing a strategy of attrition and finding a lot of success in this. But in any event, they're talking about this new strategy as some success, but that there's a lot of misunderstanding between all sides, and that, of course, the conclusion is support has to be stepped up. But the mood is much more gloomy than, let's say, this article in CNN, which I found actually, it's a pretty nauseating read. So I don't even know if I suggest people read the whole thing. But Ukraine is actually making progress against Russia. So you have a more of a, optimistic tone. But if you just go into this
Oh,
article,
wait,
and this
Danny, wait, just go back to the top image.
right,
And I just want to point out that that logo right there,
oh, look at
that is
that,
the Wolf's angle, the modernized Wolf's angle.
yes,
That is a Nazi insignia that CNN just casually splashes on their website and doesn't explain to their readers what it is, and no one will
nope.
know unless someone pointed it out. Please
Nope,
continue,
there it
Danny. I just
is.
thought that's
Wow, no,
important
that's
to.
that's a good catch. That's a good catch. It's and it's not so small there, as you can see. It's pretty large. So here is Mr. Sebastian Roblin, a former Peace Corps, Georgetown University. If anyone knows anything about Georgetown, it is where the neocons go to get educated. Essentially, it's a huge, it's a huge factory for pumping out these kind of people. And so this article, I want to go. The whole thing is a diatribe. Really, you could see it as a diatribe against people like Brian Berletic, but really, he's talking more about the realists and those forces in the United States foreign policy establishment, which are not so keen, like General Mark Milley, for example, of just going on forever and ever and ever with this conflict, and of course the GOP. But here I highlighted that it's true that the Ukrainian counteroffensive debuted with conspicuous setbacks and hasn't advanced as much as hoped. Russia's military did correct some of these mistakes in 2022, and when Ukraine's newly Western trained and equipped but inexperienced brigades launched a counteroffensive in June, they discovered Russian minefields were too dense and deep to breach quickly enough to use mine-clearing vehicles before Russian drones, artillery, and attack helicopters could detect and target them. Above all, Ukraine didn't nearly have enough of these vehicles to absorb the losses. And then here again, this is the common theme. Ukraine's military switched to slower attrition warfare, which it was accustomed. Engineers carefully cleared lanes through vast minefields, and that Ukrainian troops have now managed to advance on an average of 700 to 1,200 meters every 5 days using these methods. And so at the end of the article, of course, this is a very predictable thing. While there's all this optimism, there's this huge acknowledgement that to give Ukraine the best shot at liberating its regions occupied by Russia in 2022, Washington and NATO need to work out multi-year plans to sustain military assistance. Above all, artillery systems, ammunitions, followed by air defenses, drones, and armed vehicles. As stores of easily donated equipment from the West dry up, new large-scale production and procurement orders funded by the U.S. and its allies must be stepped up. So, Brian, your reaction to this, because there's this optimism that Ukraine is making progress, and then at the end, there's multi-year plans for sustaining assistance and acknowledgments peppered throughout an analysis like this of here are the shortages, there's not enough weapons, there's been setbacks, but oh, look at this progress. So I'm confused because I haven't really seen many verified reports on major progress that this article is claiming, but also the suggestions and the conclusions kind of lend itself to an opposing, I think, viewpoint of, is this optimism even warranted? This seems like optimism kind of overshadowing reality.
It's people not wanting to acknowledge reality is what it is. They don't want to acknowledge that the offensive failed. They didn't want to acknowledge the people pointing out the factors before the offensive was even launched that guaranteed that it would fail, that there was no possible way for this to be a success. Again, no matter how much territory they managed to seize, especially at this point, but even before the offensive was launched, they would suffer far too many losses. They would be far too depleted at the end of the offensive for it to have had made any difference. Overall, it is an attritional conflict. It is a war of attrition. And so you're trading your army in for territory that is putting you one step closer to defeat, not victory. That was the problem that Ukraine had last fall, their offensive around Kharkov and Kherson. They shed off an entire army that the West helped them build up to take territory in Kharkov and around Kherson. They depleted their forces. They depleted their trained manpower, their equipment, their ammunition. And then they had to wait for NATO to send them another army's worth of equipment, weapons, ammunition, and to try to train up these new brigades that they were going to use for this offensive. And by the way, that's not enough time to train up a brigade out of thin air. You cannot do that. It could take years to build a real brigade, an effective brigade. It is not just 4,000 men running across the battlefield. There are different units within a brigade that need to be trained. You have entry-level troops. You have their leadership. There's multiple levels of leadership within a brigade that is around 4,000. You have different types of units, tanks, artillery, infantry, and they all have to not just be trained as individual soldiers and then as a unit, but also in combined arms warfare together as a brigade and then together with other elements within the Ukrainian armed forces. There was nowhere near enough time to do all of that. It was impossible. There is no way for the US and the rest of NATO to help Ukraine do this anytime in the near future. It is impossible. So they say multi-year commitment to do what? They're already trying to expand artillery ammunition. That is the one thing that they've committed to. And they say they will be making, I think, between 83 or 85,000 rounds per month, the United States. Maybe Europe will try to match that. And they say, well, the earliest 2025, but maybe somewhere around 2028. That's years from now. And that New York Times article, I'll read the headline so people can look it up on their own. Russia overcomes sanctions to expand missile production, officials say. And in this article, they admit that Russia is making around 2 million artillery shells right now every year. It's probably much more than that. But even if it is just 2 million rounds a year, that is more now that Russia is making than the US and Europe combined will be making if and when they finally expand production. So this notion that they're going to expand production with some sort of multi-year plan, that is a fantasy. That is a fantasy. It cannot be done. It will not happen. And because this is a war of attrition, that tells you what is going to happen in the future. So articles like this are an attempt to delay the inevitable, telling the public that this has failed. We remember the US media, the Western media, doing this in regards to Afghanistan, in regards to the proxy war in Syria, in Iraq, and everywhere else the US goes, all around the world. This is what they do, and this is what they're doing in Ukraine.
Yeah, and it seems to also negate, similar to, I think it's a good comparison as well, similar to in Afghanistan, where there was always a negation of the legitimacy of the Taliban and perhaps the ability of Taliban-led forces and others to fight back against the occupation. There's always like a negation that, this isn't serious. They're just terrorists. We're good. We can stabilize this government. And at the end, it was a pretty rapid deterioration. And now, in Ukraine, on these front lines and in the analysis of the counteroffensive, there is a real negation or an attempt to negate Russia. It blows my mind to flip. It's like this flip of things where at first, especially in the first 6 months to a year of this conflict, it was throw everything in. Everything is, that is great. We're going to make huge gains there. Russia doesn't have a chance. Look at how many mistakes Russia is making. They've underestimated us. That was the narrative in the collective West. Now they're saying that Ukraine's strategy, which I don't think is a strategy, I think it's a response to the real conditions on the ground. The strategy of a war of attrition, it doesn't seem to favor Ukraine at all, and there's no attention to what could Russia do in the meantime if you have to plan years on out to achieve goals that are seemingly unachievable if they're going to take years and years to even attempt to actually successfully achieve. So what's your reaction to this? Because it does feel like Russia is still being treated as this bumbling kind of aggressor without any real attention to the reality on the ground here.
It's a very good point. the way Russia has been underestimated, and this is something the U.S. consistently does with all of its adversaries. It's doing it right now with China, if you can believe that. We hear, and even in that CNN article that you just went over, we see a lot of very flawed analysis. If it could even be called analysis, we're not even really sure if these people are genuinely trying to analyze things or if this is just propaganda that they're deliberately publishing to deceive the public. But there are severe misconceptions about Ukraine's fall offensive last year. They imagine as if this was, something that Ukraine did because it was, they were doing so well. We did such a good job arming them and equipping them. And in reality, Russia simply didn't have enough troops to cover Kharkov. They did not commit enough troops. It was a special military operation. It was not a full-scale invasion. And I don't know if you noticed this, Danny, but the Western media always does this, where every time they mention Russia's involvement in Ukraine, they always have to say full-scale invasion. That this phrase is always used. And it's almost as if they know that it isn't, but they are so desperate to convince you that it is, so they will say this. They also say unprovoked. They like to use that word all the time, unprovoked, when we all know that it most certainly was.
You wouldn't have to say
provoked.
it. Why do you have to say unprovoked
exactly.
over and over and over again? If you can say it once and hopefully it'll stick. But anyway, continue.
Exactly. So it is obviously propaganda that you're trying to drill into people's heads. So then there's the misconception that Russia thought they would just come in 3 days and take over all of Ukraine and subjugate Ukraine. We still hear U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken repeating this fallacy. It is completely false. And we know that it's false because we can see how the Russian military prepared itself. They prepared for years and years and years, probably since 2008, when NATO trained and armed Georgian forces attacked Russian forces. Russia saw that their military was inadequate, and so they endeavored to revitalize, reform, modernize their military, expand military industrial production. And from 2008 until 2022, and even up until now and well into the future, they continue doing this. They were prepared for a large-scale, protracted conflict. They had huge amounts of men, equipment, ammunition stockpiled for a very long-term conflict. That is why they still have the advantage on the battlefield right now, and this is why NATO collectively have run out of weapons, ran out of ammunition, because Russia was prepared for a long-term conflict, and NATO was not. And so again, it's almost as if it's projection. Well, we thought it would be real quick. It turned out it's a long-term conflict, and that's something that Russia got wrong. Actually, they seem very well prepared for that. It seems like NATO is ill prepared for that. So it is an underestimation of Russia. The West continues to do this. We still see analysts and Western politicians acting as if, like you say, Russia is bumbling, when in fact it seems like it has a plan and it's patiently executing it. It's avoiding provocations, and it's going to continue grinding down Ukraine until it gets the results that it wants.
Yeah, and you mentioned the CNN article, but I actually want to pull up the Financial Times article one more time because I think your point is well taken. And to be fair, I would say the Financial Times is even more reliable in their coverage of Ukraine than CNN, which is literally a propaganda mill. But Financial Times tries to speak to people in the big finance sector, and amongst the super wealthy, and protect their investments, so to speak. So here is as you said, there was a miscalculation, maybe a projection, that if Russia could be provoked in this conflict, it would fall quite quickly with a combination of pressures militarily, politically, and economically. Well, here is what they're saying now about the counteroffensive, that Ukraine's new strategy has had some success, but it'll be slow going at best without a sudden Russian collapse. Crucially, it'll be dependent on Ukraine's allies increasing production of ammunition, other equipment to sustain an attritional war. So now they kind of reveal it there that this was that there's hope of a Russian collapse, but now that is completely and utterly just out of the picture. And so now Ukraine has to, I think that's what they're really saying. That's what the neocons, the foreign policy I was trying to say is, yes, this is a war of attrition now because the initial hope of Russia's collapse actually failed. That hope was never achievable in the first place. And now we're going with what is possible under what are inconvenient, if not unfavorable circumstances.
Well, again, that paragraph right there is telling you that Ukraine has lost. They lost because none of that is possible. Number one, they're not having any success. Russian defenses were built in layers specifically to give way to particularly powerful or numerous Ukrainian assaults. And that's exactly what Russian defenses are doing. They're working exactly as designed. So no, Ukraine is not making any gains. They have bled dry their offensive potential. They have committed all of their last reserves. All of the brigades that they prepared for this offensive have been committed to the fighting, and they still have not breached the first main Russian defensive line. And after that, there's several others they still have to breach. So they're not making any success. There's no progress. There's no success at all. They're taking these villages. They're pushing Russian forces back, but that is exactly how Russian defenses were designed. So that's one. Number two, yes, like you say, they all thought Russia would just collapse. It's a gas station with nukes masquerading as a country. They have said this over and over again. But as I've tried to explain in many of my videos, and many other analysts have pointed out, Russia has a very large industrial base, even compared to other Western nations, actually in many cases bigger. As Alexander Mikuris pointed out, that the steel production of Russia is comparable to the United States. So the US, a much larger economy, a much larger GDP, a larger population, but comparable steel production, gives you an idea of how large Russian industrial capacity is versus the size of its population in relation to other Western nations. So that's important to keep in mind, because industry is what actually creates the physical world that surrounds us and changes the physical world in ways you want it changed. Military power is a product of your industrial base, and it allows you to project your political will physically on, say, a battlefield. So that is a very important aspect that the West has neglected for decades. They have neglected their industry. The United States has sent it all to China. Now they're complaining they have no industry left. But even as they recognize that as a problem, they exclude it from their analysis of, say, the conflict in Ukraine and the impact of having shed their industrial capacity and trying to go up against a nation that still has their industrial capacity. This is a huge problem. So that whole paragraph tells you that Ukraine is going to lose. There's no way for them to win. Russia is not going to suddenly collapse. And I hate to keep bringing up Nazis, but that is exactly what Adolf Hitler said before he invaded Russia. It's a large structure, but it's all rotten. All we do is kick in the door, and the whole rotten thing will come collapsing down. I'm sure Victoria Nuland said something very similar, and that is not even nearly what has happened. Again, that New York Times article is admitting that Russia's military production has only increased since all of this began. How about U.S. military production or European production? How about the U.S. or European economy versus the Russian economy? So there's a lot of things that have blown back in their faces. There's many sayings about how dangerous ignorance is. So you just pick the one you like the best and apply it. And it turns out that those sayings are absolutely true.
Yes, indeed. And lastly, in terms of Ukraine losing, your last reaction to this counteroffensive, Zelensky is going on a charm offensive, as the collective West likes to call it. but it's increasingly a desperate one. And Politico is reported on Zelensky heading to New York this weekend. Well, actually, next week, early next week, from the 19th, I believe the UN General Assembly, the 78th session is to be held. Zelensky will be there. And Politico says that Zelensky's heading to New York to court the rest of the world. This is quite interesting because this conflict has been going on for quite some time, Brian. To court the rest of the world now seems a little bit late. But as it says here, so we're going to just move through some highlights. Zelensky hopes to make his case both in a speech to the U.S. General Assembly and a blizzard of meetings with fellow leaders, including he will be meeting with Biden on the 21st in D.C., according to senior government officials familiar with the planning. But here is the crux of the matter. The effort faces serious challenges. Many of the countries that have avoided taking sides hail from Africa, Asia, and Latin America, often called the global south, and they are loath to anger any world power if it could damage their own national interests. Even if they've rhetorically condemned the Kremlin's invasion, many haven't cut economic or diplomatic ties or enforced Western sanctions on Russia, allowing Moscow to keep cash flow. Ukrainian leaders believe they have to make their case. The Zelensky trip is part of a broader surge in Ukrainian diplomacy that has coincided with Kiev's counteroffensive against Russia. So, Ukrainians worry about a growing sense of global impatience. The realization is setting in that this will be a long war. And then they talk about how Zelensky actually hasn't done a lot of diplomacy, surprise, surprise, over the course of the conflict, but now has stepped up those efforts in recent months, especially in lieu of this counteroffensive. So, Brian, this this feels like desperation. I don't even know if you could call it diplomacy. It feels more like an attempt to beat over the heads other countries around the world, an attempt to pull them away from Russia in a moment where that's obviously not going to happen. And so your reaction on um, on this so-called charm offensive and what it tells us, I think it tells us exactly what you said before, that this is a losing effort now, and the efforts are becoming more, the follow-up is becoming more desperate.
Why even bother at this point? Like you said, the conflict has been going on for so long. If he hasn't convinced all of these nations, he never will. There are really good reasons for these nations not siding with Ukraine, and they can pretend that it's because they're just trying to protect their interests and they don't want to make anyone angry. But the rest of the world can sense the waning West, its weakness, its growing. And a lot of these countries have gone along with the West, not because they wanted to, but because they have no choice. Now they have a choice. So they're all patiently waiting for the clock to run out. They see this conflict draining the West of its energy. It's laser focused on Ukraine, which means it's not meddling in their countries anymore. No one is in a rush to save Zelensky or to save the West and their proxy war in Ukraine. They're so out of touch with the reality. And who is he going to charm? He just called, his senior advisor just called Chinese people and Indian people low IQ. Here in Southeast Asia, it's a combination of Indian and Chinese heritage. Surely they're offended. So he just offended the vast majority of Eurasia between Russia and China, India, and everyone in between. He's insulted all of these people that now President Zelensky is going to try to charm. Who's going to fall for this and why?
Yeah, and you said it right. You said these
Some
countries.
also see American and
Yeah,
Europe in
and like
decline. Yes.
this is literally. I mean, this is the mainstream media. This is Politico admitting exactly as you mentioned that these countries, especially in the global South, especially in these areas, Africa, Asia, Latin America, this is what they see. It's exactly, you are correct. It says among African actors, at least part of the global South, there is an understanding that there is something shifting about international affairs, and it is not in their interest to align themselves behind any party. In a word, they see a multipolar world, and Ukraine is certainly not part of that at the moment.
And a lot of these nations recognize the West's role in their problems developing, the West would like to imagine that these countries are just underdeveloped because of their own deficiencies. But no, it was because they've been preyed on for generations by the collective West, the European colonial powers, and then the United States, who was the successor of all of these empires and continues modern day imperialism to this day. And so they are very well aware of this. And like I said, why would they side with Ukraine? And considering the trouble, even if they wanted to, they can see that Ukraine has lost. There's nothing they can do to change that. So why would they allow themselves to be recruited onto the losing side of a conflict? It makes no sense. No matter which way you cut it, it makes absolutely no sense.
Indeed. So let's get to now Asia, and particularly China, Taiwan. There have been interesting developments with regard to Taiwan. On the one hand, the Biden administration has just diverted more military aid to Taiwan from Egypt. So Egypt has come under, surprise, surprise, a BRICS country. Another country gets admitted to BRICS, and suddenly human rights matters become a problem. So the Biden administration says Egypt's committing human rights abuses. Let's move money to Taiwan. I believe also Lebanon got some of this military aid. But at the same time as this is happening, we have China sanctioning Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and other military contractors for their participation in arming Taiwan against the One China principle. But I think the real interesting story for me, in lieu of all of this, is here the Global Times reports that there is a new document to facilitate integrated development across Taiwan, and it outlines a future blueprint for its development. And the Western mainstream media went kind of nuts about this because they saw it as an attempt to reunify, but it goes against this narrative that China is trying to reunify by force. So it says one of the highlights of this plan includes the scrapping of temporary residence for Taiwan compatriots living in Fujian, encouraging them to purchase property in Fujian. So Fujian province is very close to Taiwan. It's literally across the straits. Yes, and seeking to include Taiwan compatriots in local social insurance systems so as to improve institutional guarantees for them in terms of employment, medical treatment, housing, and elderly care services. It comes at a time when Taiwan authorities continue to trumpet separatist rhetoric and act as a U.S. puppet to achieve the U.S. strategy of containing the mainland. So your reaction to these developments, because it shows a huge divergence that on the one side you have the U.S. preparing for conflict, and on the other you have China seemingly pursuing peaceful reunification, and this seems to be a big step forward. So, Brian, your take.
Well, it's brilliant when you think about it. They're giving people living on the island province of Taiwan a stake in the mainland economy and giving them access to all of these benefits. And at the same time, the U.S. is encouraging separatism on the island of Taiwan, doing exactly what Ukraine did vis-a-vis Russia, cutting themselves off from their primary economic partner, which for Taiwan is the rest of China. For Ukraine, it was Russia. And so they're crushing the economy themselves on the actual island, while China is giving the people living on the island access to economic opportunities on the mainland. It's brilliant. It's a self-powering engine of reunification peacefully. And so the harder the U.S. squeezes to try to keep their grip on Taiwan, the more people on the island of Taiwan are going to see this offer by the rest of China as attractive. And then again, if the U.S. from 2014 to 2022 training the Ukrainian military together with all of their NATO allies, training the Ukrainian military, creating this corps of NCOs over 8 years, that whole force being wiped out by the Russian intervention, and then the next army wiped out, this current army they build up for this offensive completely wiped out. What do they think is going to happen to the much, much, much smaller military on Taiwan? That is not going to be getting nearly as many weapons, and weapons that are more or less irrelevant. They're getting tanks. Tanks to do what exactly? And people keep imagining that China is for some reason going to actually invade, do an amphibious landing onto the island of Taiwan when they have more than enough missiles to scour the island of all military infrastructure. It's just another disaster in the making. They go from one failure to the next. They went from, think about it, from the Vietnam War to the Middle East, all of the places they intervened there, to Libya, a complete and absolute disaster that resonates even to this day, that flood and the thousands of people dead from it, and the surge of destitute people flooding into Europe to escape the disaster the collective West created there. And now Ukraine, and they're working on Taiwan next. What makes people think that this is going to work out any better than all of the other projects the U.S. has gotten itself involved in? And why is anyone in Taipei still engaged in this? How do they imagine they're the exception to the rule, which is wherever the U.S. goes, it completely destroys, and even the client regime that they put into power ends up on the chopping block more times than not.
Yeah, and I know you've been doing a lot of analysis recently on the expansion of the U.S.'s military footprint in the Asia Pacific. And I wanted to pull up a graphic on this because Taiwan, of course, is probably the big prize, the big cheese in this, or the big porcupine, we could call it. It's literally what U.S. defense officials national security state officials like to call Taiwan a porcupine. But this porcupine is actually quite big because it surrounds all of China. Here's Carl Zha, friend of the show, saying China is aggressively threatening U.S. national security. And here is a photo of all of many of the bases, whether it's an army base, air base, naval base, air station, or a new base of the United States surrounding China. So here is the People's Republic of China. And here is all of the bases going all the way from Japan, encircling China down to the Philippines, and of course the islands surrounding the Philippines, and Taiwan, of course, right here. So, Brian, can you give maybe some updates on the expansion of U.S.'s military footprint? I know there's been activity in Guam and the Philippines. Help us understand that graphic.
But to be clear, well, yes, they have a huge military presence all around China. Tens of thousands of U.S. troops spanning multiple bases in South Korea, all across Japan, on mainland Japan, on Okinawa. On Okinawa alone, there's a complex of bases like tumors dotting the entire island. And it really is like a tumor, just growing and killing everything good on the island. And now they're expanding into the Philippines. They had a presence in the Philippines. Like I've said before, they get pushed out at times by certain Filipino political leaders, and then they get invited back in by others. And so now is a time where they're being invited back in. There are the Batanes Islands. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but they're Filipino islands, and they're around 200 kilometers south of Taiwan. The U.S. wants to build a civilian port there, but why? For what? They're not the ones doing the majority of trade in the region. What is that there for? That is a logistics point that they will use for a future confrontation with China over their island province of Taiwan. So there's that. But building a port does not happen overnight. That's something that will probably take a few years to do. There was this agile combat employment doctrine that the U.S. Air Force is trying to adopt in the Pacific region. And what this is is building more airfields, not because you have more airplanes, but because you're going to spread out your air power more than it already is, to prevent China from just wiping out a handful of air bases and completely laying waste to U.S. air power. So if you spread it out across more air bases, it's a little more resilient in a Chinese missile attack, although I don't think so. And again, this is going to take years and years to do, if they even decide to actually do it, and to what extent is still unclear. So they're trying to expand. I was just listening to the changing U.S. Marine Corps doctrine. They're in need of ships to maintain their ability to menace nations all around the globe, but specifically places all around China's periphery. And they don't have enough ships. They're going to have fewer and fewer ships as the years go on. So it seems like the U.S. has these ambitions, but they don't have the means to reach them. And I think that's going to, just by itself is a problem for the U.S. But then when you consider that China is still in the process of growing and expanding, enhancing its combat capabilities, and also the fact that China is focused solely on defending its shores within its own territory, while the U.S. is trying to project military power thousands and thousands of miles from its own shores. You could already see, again, just like with Taiwan specifically, or the conflict in Ukraine, or just ahead of the offensive, you can see the fundamentals do not favor the United States, but the United States feels compelled to push forward anyway.
Yeah, and with the conflict in Ukraine, oftentimes what's brought up, I know Antony Blinken was just speaking at Johns Hopkins and kind of intimated to this, that one of the purposes of maybe keeping the Ukraine conflict at a steady point, freezing, sometimes they'll say, of course he wouldn't say that in a speech, but there has been a lot of talk about freezing that conflict. And oftentimes some of the concerns, many of the concerns that come out of their mouth is China is not being able to wage a future conflict with China if their capabilities are wasted away in Ukraine.
Well, a lot of people are saying that so far, I would say most of the capabilities that the U.S. has transferred over to Ukraine are capabilities they really weren't going to use in any sort of conflict with China. But with the ATACMS, now you're starting to cut into longer range weapons that the U.S. would be interested in using against China, rather than wasting on a lost proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. And then they're talking about transferring NATO weapons. I saw an article in Forbes talking about, well, if you give them F-16s, you need to give them these JSON missiles, but JSON missiles play a central role in any potential U.S. conflict with China, so that I highly doubt they would give them anything but a token amount of them, if any at all. That's the thing we have to keep an eye on. If the U.S. starts sending long-range missiles to Ukraine to use in this lost proxy war, that is them cutting into their combat capabilities that they are trying to preserve for the war they're trying to provoke with China. If they continue to preserve those capabilities, then that does signal to us that they fully plan on moving on to China next, and they'll just cut their losses or try to either freeze the conflict or just perpetuate it the way that it's going right now. Ukraine obviously isn't going to win, but if they could just prevent them from losing too quickly, collapsing, that could be a possible objective that they have. So we have to be very careful. As I've always said, the U.S. sees this as a window of opportunity that is closing. Many people would say that it has already closed, especially in terms of containing China. They think that if they do have to fight a war with China, and honestly, they don't need to, but in their mind, they need to, because they cannot imagine any other nation surpassing the U.S. and having the largest economy or the largest military on earth. They cannot imagine this because, we could talk about their ideological mindset. And what guides all of this? This irrational foreign policy that they're obsessed with pursuing. But the window most likely has already closed, but they're going to try anyway. They want to fight this conflict anyway, no matter how disastrous. They always see anything that they do, others are paying the price for it. Right now, they're fighting this proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. It's not their blood or treasure that's being spent. It's Ukraine's. It's not American territory that's being lost. It's Ukrainian territory that's being lost. They're very happy to continue doing that as long as other people are paying the cost. So if they trigger some sort of conflict with China and it stays in the Pacific, again, they don't see the price they're going to have to pay for doing that. So from their mindset, even if it's a long shot, it's worth a try anyway.
Yeah, and I'm curious about your thoughts too on now the way that China is often portrayed in the Western mainstream media in relation to its, let's say, its stability, even its conflict readiness. So there have been a series, earlier this year, there was the, demotion and removal of Qin Gang, the former foreign minister, and Wang Yi took over. And now there are rumors that China's defense minister, who continues to be under sanctions by the United States, by the way, for some bogus arms deal with Russia in 2018. But now Li Shangfu is reportedly under investigation and likely to be removed as well. And the way that this is always framed is that, as you see there, deepening turmoil within Beijing's military and foreign policy establishment. And, you can get the picture of how this is often portrayed, that China's in trouble, that China's foreign policy strategy is one that is failing. There are reports now that China's whole military strategy is about burning out the navies of its, of its neighboring countries, in response to what has happened recently. There was a spat between China and the Philippines, in the South China Sea, where China literally hosed them down with water as a measure of showing that this is a threat to our security, where you are sailing your ships, your warships. So in effect, Brian, what's your reaction to the way that the mainstream media, the Western mainstream media, talks about China's initiative, security-wise, its national security strategy, etc., in relation to this broad war that you're describing?
It just seems like they're taking every misguided step they took in regards to Russia and just repeating it in regards to China. I wonder if China's Minister of Defense is going to share a jail cell with Russian General Surovikin, who's not in jail, by the way, but the Western media said that he was. And so we just need to keep in mind all of these stories that the Western media has cooked up over the years. I mean, Danny, you've been paying attention to this as I have. For the last 10 years, China has been 6 months away from collapsing, and it's still there, stronger than ever. It's surpassing the U.S. The U.S. is putting these sanctions on China. China is circumventing them. They're doing things that are supposedly impossible to do, which, no one, I didn't doubt China even for a moment. I knew they were going to be able to circumvent these sanctions and overcome these limitations the West was trying to place on China, because I actually looked at the fundamentals in China regarding their industrial base, their education system, and we knew that they were going to overcome these, that they don't need the West anymore. The West is soon going to need China and the multipolar world that they're building. So it's the West doing the exact same thing all over again. China is just a rotten structure. All we have to do is kick the door in and everything will come collapsing down. This is almost exactly how they construct their narratives together. It's an illusion. Their economic success is all an illusion. People in China are unhappy. secretly unhappy, and we can't get the statistics to show you or any of the actual facts to show you, but just trust us. And like I said, they've been saying this for years and years, and it simply isn't so. And wishing that it was so isn't good enough, unfortunately, for the West.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. And maybe to close on this particular subject of the military buildup against China, uh, could you remind us about what the foreign policy establishment has actually said about when a potential conflict should or if it breaks out? For example, I know that in the last year or two alone, we've had the RAND Corporation, Center for New American Security, these huge Defense Departments backed think tanks come out with studies on the potential conflict and what would happen in one. And the conclusions generally veer on the US would quote unquote win, but the consequences would be disastrous. Could you remind us of what has already been said about if a war were to actually break out, between China and the United States?
Well, we see the United States, different think tanks, military leaders within the U.S. military, all saying around 2025, 2026, maybe 2028, something like that, somewhere in there. And they act as if it's China that is rushing toward war by these dates. But in reality, it is the United States that is rushing to wage war against China sooner rather than later, because as I've pointed out, the advantages that China enjoys continue to grow. There's this convergence between U.S. and Chinese military capabilities, and soon there will be a divergence, but it'll be entirely in China's favor. And so the United States needs to, if they're going to fight some sort of conflict with China, they need to do it now rather than later. What's interesting about these and disturbing about what these U.S. government-funded and U.S. arms industry-funded think tanks say when they do these war games regarding Taiwan, they say, well, if there was a conflict between the U.S. and China over Taiwan, all of the infrastructure would be destroyed, because if China didn't destroy it, we would destroy it to deny China this infrastructure. Industry would be scoured off the island. They would have no economy, but they would have their political autonomy, which does not exist because Taiwan has no political autonomy. It is a creation and a perpetuation of U.S. foreign policy. There is no self-determination on the island province of Taiwan. It is a politically captured political entity in Taipei. So there is no political autonomy. But what it actually really is the U.S. saying is, if we cannot have Taiwan, no one will. We will ensure that it's completely destroyed. China will pay the highest price for allowing itself to be provoked into a conflict with us over it. We will make them pay the ultimate price for that. That's basically what they're saying. So we have to wait and see how China allows this to play out. Just like Russia, they have been infinitely patient. They avoid provocations. There are U.S. troops on Taiwan right now. There are a number of U.S. troops, and that number actually continues to grow. This is recognized internationally as Chinese territory. By right, China is more than justified to take military action against these they have invaded Chinese territory under international law, under the United Nations recognizes Taiwan as part of China. The U.S. State Department officially recognizes Taiwan as part of China. People seem to still not understand that. But the U.S. plays this double game where they, at the same time, encourage separatism and pretend, especially to the Western public, that somehow it is an independent entity that the U.S. is protecting.
Yes, that is exactly what is being done. And you have constantly not just increases in arms, you have these troop increases, you also have increases in the diplomatic visits, the so-called diplomatic visits, and reports of increases in Taiwan so-called troops going to the United States for training. It's it's an endless barrage of escalation, and it is certainly moved toward war, which makes it pretty clear why think tanks and prominent military officials and people like Mike Minahan kind of spewing off at the mouth and getting caught doing so about a war with China by 2025 is because this is a very real agenda afoot. But Brian, I wanted to ask, do you have time for one more story? I know you said
Sure.
there's
Yes,
one more.
I'm okay. Yes.
Okay, good. Because there is one more story you mentioned, and it has to do with the economy and China. And I think it's you kind of intimated to the fact that China's economy is actually stable. So China has, as you probably have been hearing, Brian, been in the Western mainstream media dragged economically. It's seen as now an economic turmoil. There's all kinds. You can find article after article about China's real estate bubble, its crisis, that there's an economic crisis there, deflation, high unemployment, over and over and over again. And U.S. officials are also repeating this. Antony Blinken, many of them are saying, well, China's economy is not healthy. Biden was in Vietnam. He's been talking to the media a lot about how China's not doing good and China is economically unstable. Now, there's a new report, and here's what the Globalist Times had to say. A new report that says China is posting better than expected data for August as economic recovery reaches a turning point. And here, so there's a lot of good measures, positive measures about industrial output. But there's also, and I want to go down to the projections for the next third and fourth quarters of the year, the last quarters of 2023. So not only is there higher industrial output, more demand, but now there is a predicted GDP growth of 5.8% and perhaps 6+% growth in 2020 at the end of 2023. But in addition to this, Brian, I wanted to show you what Victor Gao had to say about competition with the collective West, because I think that this, regardless of there is a turmoil in the global economy.
To the British government.
And let me rewind here. So he was on British media. Victor Gao is a prominent spokesperson. He was actually the former translator of Deng Xiaoping. He had a lot to say about competition with the UK, for example, and you can just insert any country in the collective West, I believe, in place of the UK, and the analysis would be the same and correct. But at the same time, I think regardless of whatever external factors, even internal factors cause perhaps slower growth or instability, there is a lot of, how should I say, contrast and difference between the economic situations between the U.S. and the collective West that often aren't reckoned with. And so I want your reaction, Brian, to what Victor Gao is about to say here in terms of the position of China in relation to the collective West.
Are you an ally? Are you a threat? How would you regard your relationship with Britain? First of all, between China and Britain, from the Chinese perspective, Britain is not a rival, is not a competitor, it is not an enemy, is not an adversary. Britain is just an important country to get along with in peace and in friendship and for mutual benefit. Now, how Britain looks at China, it's up to the British government and people to decide. But I think it would be completely misguided for Britain to view China as an enemy or adversary or a competitor. What do China and Britain compete with? China is the largest manufacturer of automobiles. Competing with Britain? No. China is the largest exporter of EV cars and will lead the whole world in EV production. Is Britain a competitor? No. China will be the biggest and most important producer and R&D in terms of semiconductor in no time. Does that mean that China competes with Britain? No. China will be the leading nation in AI revolution. Is Britain a competitor? No. So I think British government should not overestimate its impact on the global scene and view Britain as a rival of China. China is not. China is a fact. China is a megatrend for Britain to live with and get along with. Let's make peace rather than agitating for war.
So,
I'm
China
curious
is a fact.
how that interviewer
Me too.
responded to that. I think Victor Gao was being very charitable, saying that the UK was an important country. I think it's again,
Agreed.
China has the potential to be just as bad as the United States, but they're going out of their way not to be. When the United States rose to prominence and had the ability to achieve primacy over the globe, they went ahead and they did it. China is going about this entirely differently, and this is something that is entirely lost on the West. I didn't mean to cut you off, Danny.
No. Continue. Your reaction to the comments. Yeah.
Yeah, and regarding China's economy, we don't actually know what's really going on because the West has consistently lied about China's economy over the years. But as President Xi Jinping himself said, that China's economy is not a pond; it is an ocean. It is dynamic. It has a huge amount of diversity, everything from industry of all kinds to everything else, including financial markets, real estate. A real estate bubble is not going to destroy the Chinese economy or even disrupt it the same way it would in the United States, where the economy has been transformed into a giant series of basically casino games, Ponzi schemes. There is a less and less actual economic activity taking place in the U.S. and more of these games that they play on ledger sheets. So I think it's a big mistake to imagine that a bubble in China is going to impact the economy the same way it would in, say, the U.S. or say in the UK. It's entirely different, and they're making the same assumptions and they're ignoring the same type of fundamentals in this regard as they've done with Russia. And you see where that got them in regards to Russia. China is on a much larger scale. They have advantages that Russia doesn't, but they also are working together with Russia, trading their strengths to cover their weaknesses, their different weaknesses. That's also important to understand. So I don't think, this is wishful thinking on the West part, that China will just go away. If we just ignore it, it'll go away on its own. If we just give them another 5 or 10 years, their economy will implode because how could they possibly surpass us? But they're going to, and it's not something that you can just wish away, and it will not go away. The other thing that I always say, and I think is important to say, is that this whole notion that the West cannot allow China to surpass them makes no sense at all in the first place. China's population is larger than the G7 combined. It has a massive industrial base. Again, they graduate millions more in science, technology, engineering, mathematics than the United States does. Why shouldn't they have the largest economy? Why shouldn't they have the largest industrial base and military? Why shouldn't they be the most powerful nation on earth? They have the largest population on earth. Well, India has surpassed them, but you know what I mean. It's much larger than the collective West. Why does the West get to maintain primacy over the planet? It goes back to this toxic ideology that has spanned generations, where people in the West honestly, deeply believe they are superior and that they're entitled to primacy over the globe, period. And nothing else needs to be considered. And this is an entitlement that they will fight jealously to protect. But that is a departure from reality. And if this premise, departing from reality, is something they're building everything else on top of, that will also be further and further diverted away from reality. And we already see what that reaps in places like Ukraine, and it'll be even more devastating when the collective West attempts to confront China, irrationally confront China, to stop it from just this natural process of a larger country surpassing them.
And another point, because those are all really good points, is to wish and even pursue a policy that degrades, so-called contains, weakens China's economy has immeasurable, immense effects on the world economy as a whole, including on the West. And that was, in terms of backfiring, we've seen that hard with the sanctions on Russia. But with China, when Victor Gao says China is a fact that the UK, and we could insert literally the United States or any other Western country, needs to live with, that is 100% true. And I want to show you, Brian, because we talk a lot about the Belt and Road Initiative, and we are about to, there will be a lot, we're about to head into probably a huge propaganda storm as the Belt and Road Forum in China kicks off in October. But I want to show you, the G20 had a sort of breakthrough of sorts that the United States hyped up and the collective West hyped up with the announcement of the India, Middle East, Europe corridor. But something is very interesting about this corridor. And here is Arnaud Bertrand. He says, irony of the day, the map of the new Middle East, India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor that's supposed to represent another initiative to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative. And where does that corridor end? In the port of Piraeus. Who owns that port? That's in Greece, China. So here, if you want to see a close-up of that map, this is what the corridor would look like, trying to connect India's economy, Saudi Arabia's energy, etc., all the way into Europe. But that port, and one interesting thing about this port, and I'll pull it up before we get to your reaction to this, Brian, is if we go to the Belt and Road Initiative, let me pull it up, a map of that in terms of its overall plan, looking at the maritime Silk Road as well as the economic belt, so the belt and the road. So here you have the maritime belt, and look at where that belt ultimately intersects. It goes into Greece, which is the port of Piraeus, which was built by China and is Greece's main port. And I just wanted to show that, there is this contradiction of sorts, if not an outright antagonism, with this notion that you can weaken China's economy, you can undermine the Belt and Road Initiative, and at the same time hope to gain anything but future losses with that kind of effort.
So the U.S. is backing this Belt and Road alternative, but who's going to build this? How long is it going to take? Is it ever even going to happen? Did they start it already, Danny? This is the first, this is honest. Like, I don't pay attention to these things because they had the Blue Dot Network. People probably have no idea what I'm talking about. And then they had Build Back Better Worlds, which, I mean, at least this is a map of something that at least they took. Maybe they heard me saying this and they're like, hey, okay, this time let's just like make up some lines on a map and say this is some new corridor that we're actually going to build. Because last 2 or 3 times we didn't even have a map or like a computer graphic image of a port or something. So let's at least, because the US isn't even building infrastructure in the US. So I don't know what they're actually going to be doing here, except maybe financing. And then when they talk about Chinese debt trap diplomacy, I mean, what do you think the U.S. is going to do? And this is, no matter how much the U.S. wants to achieve this, they are incapable of doing it because of the systemic problems in the U.S. system, where corruption and profit-driven economics trumps all else. And this is the reason why they failed in Afghanistan. If you read the programs that were set out to build the rebuild Afghanistan as almost as if it was the 51st state of America, but that never happened because the contractors they brought in, including gigantic contractors like they just wanted to make their money and go home and spend their money. They didn't care if the project succeeded. The minute they were done with it, and they would do the bare minimum to fulfill the contract, and they would leave. And if it was destroyed, if it failed, if it collapsed, better for them because then they could come in and do it again and make even more money. And that's why Afghanistan failed, because they are parasites that came to strip mine a place that had nothing to begin with. And so what comes from that? Nothing. They left behind nothing. And now they want to compete with China, but they don't have the mentality necessary to commit to this. You actually have to invest in infrastructure, which is something the U.S. is incapable of doing, because a company investing in R&D, that means you're diverting money away from pure profits and you're putting it into something else other than profits. They would rather not do that. That's why, say, the U.S. auto industry has been selling Americans the same car for 10, 20 years. They didn't want to innovate. They didn't want to move over to electric vehicles. They were only doing it because Tesla came along and disrupted their big, fat, lazy monopoly. And so here is China coming along. And now maybe this big, fat, lazy monopoly that has been U.S. hegemony, it's waking up, but does it have the capability to actually compete? And I would say, no, they don't. And so it would be nice to see the United States and China building infrastructure, competing to build infrastructure around the globe. And as you pointed out, incidentally, intersecting and linking up. That would be so nice, but I just don't see it happening. And unfortunately, the one thing the U.S. has committed to do to compete with the Belt and Road Initiative is arm, fund, and stir up terrorists all along where Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure goes, in Pakistan, in Myanmar, in Xinjiang, China. They have stirred up terrorists to literally destroy Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure, to kill the engineers building it, to kill the security forces protecting them. That is the one thing that the U.S. has committed to. And I believe that is their primary strategy regarding the Belt and Road Initiative, unfortunately.
Yes, no, I definitely agree with that. And I also agree with the assertion that there isn't going to be anything built here. This corridor, I believe, was all about trying to get Saudi Arabia and India, given all that's happened with BRICS, all that has happened with regard to Saudi Arabia and India's relationship with Russia and China, the strengthening of that it's all about trying to ensure, by offering them perhaps tangible benefits that may not actually be realized, in order for them to continue cordial relations. But I truly do not think there will be any development anytime soon to build any kind of corridor that could compete or be at the scale of anything like the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think we have some evidence of this. As you said, Brian, over and over and over again, Build Back Better World, etc. Plans and plans and plans have been announced. Nothing has happened. I think the biggest one was the G7 summit in 2022, where there was this announced, that there was a formal launch of a partnership for global infrastructure and investment, where the G7 plus, some other countries as well, pledged so-called $600 billion for infrastructure investment and development to counter the Belt and Road Initiative. This was explicitly what they said, what Biden said, what I think Boris Johnson was actually in power at the time, what they all said about this. However, we have heard nothing about this. Zero. There's been nothing in the way of developing any kind of project, flagship or otherwise. So
Danny, when you brought up the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor, I looked at a DW article and it says the project, if completed, could act as a foil to China's Belt and Road Initiative. So I mean, even in these articles talking about it, if completed, I mean, why would you talk about it like that if it was a concrete project that they were determined to push forward? It seems like they can't even convince themselves that this is going to happen.
Right. All right. I mean, that's a lot of the mainstream media with almost every topic related to Russia and China at this point. It's if perhaps argue, there's a lot of arguing, but I'll pull up that article as well because I think it is interesting. India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor to counter China. And that's how it was talked about, which is why Biden goes to Vietnam directly after the G20 summit, and they ask him, "Hey, are you trying to counter China here and elsewhere? Because this seems to be pretty calculated." And he mumbled and bumbled, and you couldn't really understand him. And he said, "No, no, no, we're not for a Cold War. Great relationship with Xi." But as you said, Brian, the project completed could act as a foil. And of course, there's ambitious projects supposedly. Are we countering the Belt and Road Initiative? And as you said, and then they even cite that G7 meeting in May in Japan, that where the world's seventh country pledged so-called $600 billion for countering the Belt and Road Initiative. But yet we're still talking about could, may, will it happen? Nothing ever really does happen in this way.
And another thing, look at Europe. Look what's happening to their economy. So you're building this corridor between India and Europe, whose economy is spiraling because of their sanctions they put on Russia. India is never going to split from Russia, not under any circumstance that I could imagine. And so what is India going to be sending to or receiving from a Europe where manufacturing is more expensive now because they cut themselves off in a self-inflicted economic injury, basically? They cut themselves off from cheap hydrocarbons from Russia, and now they're getting liquefied natural gas from the United States across an ocean, which will always be more expensive than Russian energy, which is now going to China. You're trying to create a similar project to the Belt and Road Initiative, but you're doing it in all the wrong ways, and you don't have the right fundamentals to do it in the first place. So it's like a cheap knockoff. It just seems doomed from the very beginning. And I think India's best bet is to get involved in the Belt and Road Initiative. Could you imagine how powerful that would be? Saudi Arabia fixed its relationship with Iran because it wanted to do more business with Russia and China. I don't think that this proposal by the U.S. is going to convince them to come back into the fold and be, it's like a hostage gets out of the bank and the hostage taker is trying to lure them back in. It just doesn't seem like it's something that's going to happen.
No, and as that map of the Belt and Road Initiative showed quite clearly, with Greece's really singular port that manages much of its economic activity built by China in the Belt and Road Initiative as part of and under the auspices of the Belt and Road Initiative. China says this all the time. It's proof there that China is well integrated in the world economy, supply chains. Even with this courting of Vietnam, China said clearly, any economic activity you do with Vietnam is likely going to be a result of China-Vietnam economic relationships, because both of these countries are committed to industrial output and increasing that. And a lot of the ways that Vietnam has been able to increase its industrial output has been by integrating its economy with China's, being able to trade in a way where the inputs and the outputs align and match. And then when they do trade with other countries like the United States, they're using those very same inputs and outputs for broadening relationships with any other country, including the U.S. So the idea that you're going to weaken China's economy and expect that that's going to be a boon for you is really a losing game, because China is very well integrated. You try to counter the Belt and Road Initiative, you're basically stepping on the Belt and Road Initiative's tracks already laid. That's the reality. So the game seems to be lost.
And I was just wondering, because President Biden was in Vietnam, calling Vietnam a third world country. Just saying what everyone in the West actually really thinks about Southeast Asia. That's what they honestly actually think, that the entire region is inferior and should be subjugated to the West. And they just put on this polite face and try to flatter you into subordinating yourself to it. But the reality is that even though people say that Vietnam and China are at odds, China, the biggest source of imports into Vietnam is from China. China is one of the largest export markets for Vietnam, although the U.S. Slightly larger. But the only major infrastructure projects being built in Vietnam are being built in cooperation with China, and Vietnam's connection to infrastructure projects beyond its borders is also being facilitated by China, not the United States. And the US will never be able to facilitate any of these projects domestically or beyond Vietnam's borders or the borders of any other country. Again, like I said, they're not even keeping up infrastructure inside the United States itself. So if they can't even do that, how are they going to be building railroads and ports from India to Greece? It makes no sense. And people allowing themselves, if there are national leaders who are signing on to this and allowing themselves to be pulled into this, rather than, I could imagine them doing it, signing it to be polite, even though they're fully committed to working with China and the multipolar world. I can see that happening. But if anyone actually allowed their country to get pulled back into this scam that the U.S. is trying to pull on everybody, then that really does bode ill for those countries that would be doing that.
Yes, indeed. So Brian, it's been a great show today. I think we can conclude the conversation here. We covered a lot of ground. Before we go, everyone, just the very quick announcements. Tuesday, the next time I'll be live will be with the Duran. So I'll be joined by them. We'll get more into similar topics as well as the UN General Assembly, which will have kicked off of the day prior. So Tuesday, 1 p.m. Eastern, that's the 19th of September. Be there, set your calendars, and I'll be sure to notify everybody through here. And otherwise, before you leave here, of course, like the stream, subscribe to the channel if you're new, and check out the links in the description from Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, Substack, etc. for ways to support this program. Brian, do you have any announcements, anything that you want to plug before we head out?
Well, first of all, thank you, as always, for having me on. I always enjoy these conversations. I hope people who tuned in learned something. Tomorrow, 8 p.m.
Yes,
Bangkok time, 9 p.m. Beijing time, Angelo Giuliano will be doing the first of what we hope will be weekly roundtable discussions on his channel. So I'll be appearing at least for part of that. There seems to be a lot of people being invited to this.
Yeah, I know. I was about to say
I don't know how
try, but I know
crazy.
it's like a chill pop, and I was going to announce that actually. Thank you I had the link up here. I'm actually going to put it in the video description as well, so people can tune in tomorrow.
So we'll be doing that. I don't know what's going to happen because there's so many people that might show up, but maybe in the future there'll be like Gonzalo Lira's roundtables where he had a particular topic and he would invite people who were experts on that topic. Sometimes he would just have like an open house and just have anyone who wanted to show up over the course of like 4 hours. So we don't know. We'll see how it goes.
Great. Yes. I put it in the video description. I'll put it in the chat as well. People should save that date. I was actually going to try to make it, but then I saw the list and I was like, wow,
that's a lot of people. I don't know.
It's basically all of the best geopolitics content creators. And I'm actually going to try to pop in. It may or may not work out depending on
if you're a cheapskate like me and you just have the free version of StreamYard, I think you could only have 4 or 5 people on at a time.
Oh, so that's a good point.
I don't know what Angelo is going to do.
For me, I can have 10, given that I'm in the middle tier. But you can only have 5 for the free.
That would be crazy. I don't think I've ever seen a StreamYard stream with 10 people.
I don't know. It would probably look wild on the screen too. You'd have, it's already a weird setup, even just with 3, where it's 2 on top, 1 on the bottom. 4, it looks a little more symmetrical, but I can't imagine anything more than that. It feels like everyone will look very tiny.
We'll find out. We'll find
out. All right, everyone. Well, be sure to tune in anyway. It's being advertised as a chill stream, but I'm sure there will be a lot of good and serious conversation about all the topics that you enjoy, from Angelo, Brian, and the rest. So with that said, though, good night, Brian. Good morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you are. And hopefully you'll come Tuesday as well to the live stream with the Duran, 1 p.m. Eastern, the 19th. Take care and bye-bye.